Easter is perhaps the most important weekend on the Christian calendar. I mean, sure, loads of people get behind Christmas because who doesn't love a good birthday party? But Easter though, well, it's a little trickier. Because if you bother to look beyond the chocolate and the hot cross buns to the cross itself, well then you find an event that is both physically and emotionally horrific, as well as powerfully amazing, where one man stayed true to the path that led to self-sacrifice and as a result gave us the greatest gift of all, the ability to have a personal relationship with God. Easter is a special time for me, not for the reasons you may be thinking about. Easter camp is where I met the man that I would marry. 23 years ago, I decided I was going to swear off men and sort my life out. It wasn't that I'd completely abandoned my faith. In fact, my faith was actually in better condition than it had been for quite a while. It was just that I was a bit lukewarm with it, and otherwise I was a bit of a mess. Relationship-wise, the less said about that, the better. So into this mess came Easter, and I decided to do something that I had used to do before I left for the UK. I needed to find something, so I signed up for camp. Flaxmill had been the camp that I used to go to, but that was no longer running, so I decided to go to Cherry Tree Pool. By the time I got there, I was tired, frustrated, and knew that I desperately needed to change some things. Look, I didn't participate in all the activities. I did quite a bit of sleeping. It's what happens when you are emotionally drained. Your body rests, tries to heal itself if it's given the chance. My body took that chance. Anyway, over the course of the weekend, I started to take notice of one of the musicians. I was just drawn to him. We talked, we laughed, he gave me a neck and shoulder rub or 2 or 3. He had great hands, and I keep my tension in my neck and back. Finding someone that's like that is pretty awesome. Somehow, over the course of those few days, I decided I wanted to keep him. And so I told him that. 6 weeks later, we were engaged. 6 months later, we were married. Now, I know this wasn't the Easter story that you were expecting, but I shared it to emphasise a point. See, that first Easter, the story they got, I think, was a far cry from the one they were expecting. See, if Jesus was the saviour as they believed he was, then surely triumph was not far away. Admittedly, the adventure so far hadn't always gone according to plan. All those conversations with sinners and unclean people. And there were things Jesus just didn't seem to get. But that was okay. Things were going to change. Yes, the disciples had been stretched in their thinking, in what they'd previously thought was even probably possible. Some of the things Jesus did were miraculous. Food, healing, walking on water. It had been a crazy ride. He'd even said some strange things about the church and about women, amongst other things. It was all good though, because he was God's chosen one. And then it all comes tumbling down. Judas betrays Jesus. Jesus is arrested. The disciples get scared, and Peter denies Christ 3 times before the cock crows. This is not how the story was supposed to play out. Then it gets worse. Jesus is sentenced to die horrifically on the cross. First, though, he's brutalized. He is whipped. His body is torn apart. Flesh is torn away, exposing muscle, possibly even bone. Blood is dripping to the ground because wounds are just not given any time to heal. There is blood trickling into his eyes from a crown of thorns that has been savagely beaten down on his head. He is then beaten with a stick whilst being mocked and spat on. And then he is forced to carry the very thing he is going to be killed on. Every step with that crossbeam must have been agonising. And even once that was taken from him, moving would still have hurt. Surely this is not how things were meant to play out. And then the horror story kept going. Christ was nailed to the cross. Every time a hammer connected with that nail, it would have sent shockwaves through his body. Every move of that crossbeam as it was raised into place would have sent spasms of pain through a body that already suffered more than most of us could imagine. And then once upright, with his feet nailed into place, the slow suffocation began. Now, no one deserves to die like that, especially not an innocent man whose only crime was to tell the truth and to call out the religious elite. Jesus shook their safe little world, and for that they wanted him to pay. And this is how the story in the physical goes. When Jesus said, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" and breathed his last, that is where many expected the story to end. They so expected this end that they treated his body the way they treated any other, as tradition dictated. Sure, the only thing different was that his tomb was guarded, but that was how the religious elite covered all their bets. They said, we don't really believe he's the Messiah, but we don't want people to steal his body and fake a resurrection, so we want the tomb guarded. How they thought one soldier would be a match for a group of disciples if they were so set on starting a conspiracy theory, well, I don't know. But that's beside the point, because the disciples were nowhere to be found. They'd gone and hid, and as far as they could see, everything had fallen apart. They had no idea what was going to happen now. I'm sure there was a lot of self-doubt and questioning that went on during this time. But whilst the men were reevaluating, it was the women who went to the tomb and discovered the risen Christ. And it was a woman who had the first conversation with him. That time between death and resurrection, for all the uncertainty in the lives of those who'd walked with Jesus, that time was incredibly important. It is during that time that true victory was achieved. Christ suffered as he did, died as he did, because humanity's actions required punishment. Christ needed to die because the enemy needed to be met on his ground and beaten. Perhaps Christ did as all the dead did and walked into hell. But with perfect timing, whilst the devil had a huge grin on his face, he walked up to him and said, "I don't belong here. The stain of you has never touched me. I wore it as a cloak so that I could take the place of others. So I could come here and tell you to your face that you have lost. Oh, and by the way, the blood I shed is enough to pay the price for those who choose me and choose my Father." Look, the truth is, I don't understand all that happened on that day. I don't understand the math of it, how the sacrifice of one can save so many. But then I don't understand calculus either. I do know, though, that there are some things that we just have to accept without knowing all the ins and outs of what's going on. And what happened that day on the cross at Golgotha is one of those things. It is a thing that simultaneously affected so many lives, but was also, for so many, deeply, deeply personal. Do Do you want to know why I told you that story? Why I used to go to that Easter camp all those years ago? Why it was where I decided that I could sort my life out? It was the cross. Flaxmill had a cross that was positioned so that Easter Sunday morning the sun would rise behind it. And on that morning, we would all get up in silence, and I would sit in front of that cross, and I would consider what I needed to consider. I would contemplate the crucifixion, and I would remember that the cross is empty, that the tomb is empty, and that Jesus is sitting with his Father in heaven, having opened that pathway between both places. And I think about the sacrifice that was made for me. I am saved not because I was worth it, not because I deserved it. I am saved because God has seen something in me, like he sees something in all of you. I am saved because the gift that was offered is a gift that I have chosen to believe and chosen to accept. There is something deeply personal and powerful when we meditate on the empty cross. And I am so grateful for that sacrifice that was made, for the gift that was given, and for the fact that I have been called. Someone loved me enough to shed their blood for me. Easter is a time for reflection, a time for love. It is the perfect time for pushing in deeper and reconnecting. Many things stop around Easter time, though it is really easy to get caught up in the glut of marketing ploys and chocolate consumption. I would recommend a time of introspection. Consider the power of the sacrifice and the amazing gift that we have all been given.